Time now for our weekly injury update with Dr. Stephen Pomeranz of MRI Online. And Dr. Pomeranz, they don't get any bigger than this. The injury to Alabama star quarterback Tua Tagovailoa. And the reason why this is big is because he was scheduled to be the #1 overall draft pick in the 2020 draft. We're told it's a hip injury, so what is the full extent of what we're dealing with here?
Well, according to the media, he has had what we call a fractured dislocation. So the hip is a ball and socket joint, and it can dislocate in any direction, but it almost always dislocates out the back. And you might say, well, why is that? Well, if you get hit from the back to push the hip forward, you got this thing in the back that protects you called your buttocks. So that's the reason why the hip doesn't get driven forward very often. Now, when the hip dislocates to the back, it often comes out in a way that's somewhat unnoticed. In other words, it's shocking that you could have a hip dislocation. It'll often pop right back in place, Solly, and the young man or woman will get back up and they'll want to continue playing. And I've seen this happen even in orthopedic surgeons' kids. And the orthopedic surgeon may not even notice their own kid has had a hip dislocation. That's how subliminal they can be. On the other hand, when the hip comes out and it takes out a piece of the cartilage in the back, or more importantly, it takes out the bony wall, because the ball has to have a place to go. And when it comes out the back, it can just push off the whole back rim that holds it in place. And that's a type of fracture. When that happens, depending upon the size of the fracture, you may need to operate on it. Now, that's the minority of hip dislocations. Unfortunately, that's what's occurred here. The fact that they had to go in and do a repair means that he had a fracture of substantive size. Now, your next question is, well, what does that mean to his long-term career? He's obviously out for the season. Mm-hmm. And the answer is, the prognosis is pretty good. It's pretty variable as long as he doesn't have another injury that we're not aware of. Now, you'll all remember the story of Bo Jackson.
Yes.
I mean, Bo Jackson had what we call a transient. In other words, in a moment in time, he had a subluxation or a dislocation of the hip. The hip came out of a socket, went back into the socket, and he had a hairline fracture that probably went unnoticed. And as a result of that, the blood supply to the hip disintegrated, and thus his hip disintegrated. That's called a vascular necrosis. So he basically lost his hip and had to have a hip replacement. What determines that is if the person continues to use the hip after the injury, and also the amount of time the hip is out of the socket. Now, I don't know if Tua's hip went right back into the socket or they had to reduce it when he got to the hospital. But that is a very important issue, because if it was out when he got to the hospital, the chances of him having a vascular injury go up. So the bottom line is we don't know what the long-term prognosis is. But for an isolated hip dislocation, even with a fracture, if that's all he had, those two things, the prognosis is very, very good as long as he receives the time needed to heal.
Well,
does that answer your question?
Yeah, I mean, you gave us a lot of information there to think about. I remember the fall. I remember there were defensive players who fell on him. It was the trauma and the force to that hip joint seemed to be very prominent as his knee jammed into the ground, and that with the weight of those other two defensive players upon him, you can just probably imagine if there was some kind of dislocation that it would have been significant. Given the youthfulness of his age, given the fact that he's going to be out for the season and that there will be substantive time for recovery before he's going to have to go back and train and begin using the hip, just give us your idea of his ability to return and play and how it might affect his draft status. When doctors go in to represent a team, they're going to take a look at him, and they're going to go back and report to the team, should you draft him, should you not draft him, here's the likelihood of a re-injury. How does that all play out?
Well, I think it's going to be very clear-cut. Unlike some injuries like, pure cartilage injuries and ligamentous injuries, which can be very ephemeral, very difficult to predict the short, intermediate, and long-term prognosis. This kind of injury is pretty easy to predict. So even though he had a violent hip dislocation with a fracture, if that's all we're dealing with, and remember that is a lot, but if that's all we're dealing with, then they're going to know quite handily whether he's going to be back to his original self. And what I mean by that is, fractures repair themselves. Fractures are often better than ligamentous injuries. So fractures get better. The fact that the hip was out of the socket, as long as his femoral head has not lost its blood supply, and I suspect it is not, he's going to do very, very well over a period of time. On the other hand, if he's had another complicating injury that I described, like he's injured the femoral bone, which is basically the ball inside the socket, if that has occurred, that's a whole different animal, and then the prognosis is extremely guarded.
Well, Dr. Pomeranz, I can tell you, I can take you all the way back to that game when Bo Jackson was injured. I played against Bo in that game on that very day in 1990. It was actually, I think, January of 91 when he sustained that injury. From that time to now, how much has medical science advanced? In other words, what more do we know now that maybe they did not know then that you think could prove helpful with the recovery of Tua Tagovailoa?
Well, for one thing, MRI was not in its prime then. Had an MRI been done on Bo Jackson the next day, or that day, we have an MRI in the stadium here in Cincinnati. If it had been done that day or the next day, they would have seen, and I believe the game was played in Oakland, if I remember correctly.
In Los Angeles, to be exact. They were the LA Raiders then, remember?
So you got me on that one. And had they done an MRI at that time, even if it was a hairline fracture, which you almost never see on X-ray, it would have picked it up on MRI in a microsecond. So they would have known to sit him down, rest him, et cetera, and watch him carefully. So the imaging technology has improved dramatically. Yes, surgical techniques have advanced, but this is sort of a blocking and tackling fix. I'm not an orthopedic surgeon. I'm a diagnostician, but they're going to plate this thing and affix it to where it was. And those techniques have evolved somewhat. They've improved, but I don't think that's the critical issue here. He's got great surgeons, people that absolutely know what they're doing. But the key is to make sure he does not have one of these complications like a ligamentous rupture. There are some ligaments in the hip that are very important, one called the ligamentum teres, to make sure he doesn't have a hairline fracture in the joint, because that can devitalize the femoral head and it can crumble, as it did with the great athlete Bo Jackson, and that's got to be avoided at all costs. So the diagnostic measures have improved dramatically since the 90s.
Blood supply to the hip area is crucial when you talk about recovering from any injury in that specific area. Dr. Pomeranz, I feel like I'm smarter today. I want to thank you for dropping the knowledge on us. This is why we need you each and every week here on our MRI and our weekly update, because you do a great job. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me, Sally. Have a great week.
All right, all the best.
Thanks for watching the PFF YouTube channel. And if you want to subscribe, all you have to do is push the button. Don't forget everything you get. A little fantasy, push the button. A little green line for the gambling aspects of the game, push the button. College football, push the button. The YouTube channel from PFF.